AMD provides developers full low-level control of Radeon Adrenalin GPU drivers as part of driver experiments. Developers are now free to experiment with AMD's Radeon Adrenalin GPU drivers through the new Driver Experiments feature. AMD gives devs more control of Adrenalin Radeon GPU drivers for tuning. Available driver experiments include support for ray tracing, shader, GPU work graphics, and more. AMD has made a smart move by adding driver experiments in its tool suite, which will now allow game developers to tweak stuff they couldn't previously. This change has been introduced in the Radeon Developer Tool Suite, which provides developers with plenty of helpful tools like Radeon GPU Detective RGD, Radeon GPU Profiler RGP, Radeon Memory Visualizer RMV, and Radeon Ray Tracing Analyzer RRA. The driver experiment will essentially unlock settings for the developers that will allow them to play with various parameters without modifying the source code or configuration. Earlier, this was only possible by AMD engineers, but these options will now be available in the Radeon Developer Panel, which features support for the following: disable mesh shader support, disable sampler feedback support, disable ray tracing support, disable variable rate shading support, disable GPU work graphs support. Developers can optimize their games themselves by understanding what works better for the performance and what does not. For instance, if the game crashes or suffers from serious performance issues, developers can try resolving the issue by activating options like disable ray tracing support and see if it is the actual culprit. For the most up-to-date information, including supported hardware and software, the list and description of all the experiments currently available. RDP repository on GitHub. Via GitHub, there are more advanced features like disable low precision support, disable native 16-bit tie-up support, disable AMD vendor extensions, disable compute queue support, and disable copy queue support to further enrich the tools suite for the developers. There are plenty of optimization features as well, which will allow disabling or controller shader compiler behavior to improve the performance. Disable floating point optimizations. Disable shader compiler optimizations. Disable barrier optimizations. Disable acceleration structure optimizations. Force shader wave size. Disable ray tracing shader inlining. Disable shader cache. Developers can disable more parameters from the graphics driver, which are enabled by default but now will let them help in debugging. Apart from these, AMD has introduced safety features for making applications and games more stable. This may lead to some performance degradation but will help developers identify the type of error causing the instability. Disable depth stencil texture compression. Zero unbound descriptors. Thread-safe command buffer allocator. Force structured buffers as raw. Vertical synchronization. Essentially, the driver experiments opens up the way for low-level control of the AMD Adrenalin driver without changing the actual source code. With such a versatile tools suite, it will make it easy for AMD to handle the game optimizations since developers are allowed to do it themselves.